Week 14, we saw some players break out and have good games. And here's a few quarterbacks you should add on waivers here heading into Week 15 and hopefully your second round of your playoffs. The first guy's Jalen Hurts of the Philadelphia Eagles. Hurts was a guy that was on this waiver wire video last week. And once again, he's on it this week after a huge ball game for Hurts and the Eagles with the upset victory over the New Orleans Saints yesterday. And a great game it was, and Hurts, he looked professional, he looked poised, and that offense ran a little better with him on the center than with Carson Wentz. I know Hurts, he had a fumble in the game, but he still did his thing. He played well, and he led his team to victory. And for fantasy owners, it was a good game for Hurts. If you started him, especially in 2 quarterback leagues, you most likely did. But Hurts, 167 passing yards, a touchdown, but he added 106 yards rushing, which is huge to get 10 points from the rushing category for Hurts. That's 21 fantasy points. It was a solid game, and now he's got a pretty decent matchups coming up as Hurts. Next week at Arizona, I think he could do work, and then week 16, if you make the championship with him, he's at Dallas, which is a poor defense. So Jalen Hurts, throwing the ball, it wasn't great, but to run for 106 yards is a huge number in this ball game, and he's a guy available in 83% of leagues. So get to Hurts. The second guy's Derek Carr of the Vegas Raiders. Carr with a huge ball game versus the Indianapolis Colts. 316 yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 2 with those 12 yards rushing with a rushing touchdown as well. Derek Carr, he looked good versus a pretty tough Colt defense. I know they got a pick 6 off of him later on in the game, but Carr had a good fantasy day, and now he's got a good matchup versus the Chargers in Week 15 that give up the 6th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. And Carr, he's available in 53% of leagues, so he's not a terrible option next week, even though we know Carr, he's been inconsistent this year. And his last matchup versus the Chargers, he didn't have a great game, mediocre, 165 yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 14 rushing yards with a fumble loss. But he's a guy, if I'm in a pinch or in a very deep league, a 2 quarterback league, he's a guy I look to get. The third quarterback's Drew Lock of the Denver Broncos, another guy who's been inconsistent for the most part this season's Lock. But Lock, another good game yesterday versus a decent Panther defense with 280 yards, 4 passing touchdowns, 4 rushing yards, and a lost fumble. And he's available in a high percentage of leagues at 89% is Lock. And Lock, he's got a good matchup next week versus the Buffalo Bills that give up the 15th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. Even though I know the Bills yesterday, they look pretty decent. The matchup's not bad on paper for Lock, but he's a guy, I don't know if I'll 100% trust him. He's an every other week quarterback, it seems like. He just can't put a bunch of games together and have huge games. So Lock's the third quarterback. The fourth guy, Tua Tagovailoa of the Miami Dolphins. Tua, he had a good game versus the Chiefs with 316 yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 24 rushing yards, and a touchdown. He was good for 32 fantasy points, so I was surprised he had that good of a ball game, was Tua. And next week, he's got a decent matchup versus the New England Patriots, and he's a guy, he could get the job done. 2 quarterback leagues more, I would try to get Tua, and he's available in about 85% of fantasy leagues. So Tua, next week, it's going to be a bit of a tougher matchup, even though I thought this Kansas City matchup was going to be tough, but it wasn't, and he did a good job. He got Mike Gesicki involved. Even though Devontae Parker went down, Gesicki, he's still a good guy to have at tight end if he still plays. And Tua, he's a decent pickup next week versus the Patriots, but I don't think he'll have a great game, probably 20, 23 fantasy points. But if you need a quarterback for whatever reason, he's a guy to go get in the 5th and final quarterback. Each and every week I talk about him, but no one still adds him enough to have in their leagues, and that's Phillip Rivers of the Indianapolis Colts. Phillip Rivers with a huge ball game yesterday with 21 fantasy points, and him and T.Y. Hilton, they're on the same page now, him and Hilton, and he had a big ball game again, Hilton, over 100 yards and 2 touchdowns, and Rivers, he's over 20 fantasy points the last 4 or 5 weeks now, and next week he's got another good matchup versus the Houston Texans, where Rivers just had a 24-point fantasy say. So Phillip Rivers, if he's out there, I'll say it again for the 3rd or 4th week in a row, he's a guy you should go out there and get, and that's a few quarterbacks I'm looking to add on waivers here heading into Week 15.